Autumn 1944. A prisoner compound near Reims, France. The evening air carried the acrid smell of cheap tobacco and burning coal as 19 German POWs huddled around a salvaged tin stove in Compound C. Among them sat Hauptmann Klaus Richter, a veteran Luftwaffe pilot with 23 kills to his name. His Iron Cross now confiscated by American guards who barely looked old enough to shave. He leaned back against the rough wooden barrack wall, listening to the familiar boasts echoing around the circle. "Dickadora!" sneered Feldwebel Hans Müller, using the mocking nickname German pilots had given the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Fat Dora, flying like a pregnant cow. He mimicked the ungainly shape with his hands, drawing bitter laughter from the circle. Another prisoner, a former tank commander named Werner, tapped his tin mug rhythmically, clang, 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 imitating what he claimed was the clumsy drone of those American milk jugs. Around them, men who had fought from Poland to the Ostfront, who had witnessed the Luftwaffe's glory over France and endured its collapse over Germany, nodded in grim agreement. To pilots trained on the elegant Bf-109 and the razor-sharp FW-190, the American fighter had always seemed like a cruel joke. A 7-ton brute with a barrel fuselage, a greenhouse canopy, and wings that looked too stubby for its massive frame. It was everything German engineering scorned: heavy, inelegant, unrefined. Then the ground trembled. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. It started as a low vibration beneath their feet, the kind that makes men pause mid-sentence. Within seconds, the sound arrived, a roar so deep and overwhelming it seemed to compress the air itself. The fence posts rattled. Tin cups clattered against the table. And then came the unmistakable hammer. Brrr, tat, 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 tat. 8 synchronized Browning M2 machine guns, opening up beyond the hills. Each gun spitting 800 rounds per minute into a convergence zone of annihilation. Columns of black smoke mushroomed above the tree line. The Americans guarding the camp barely flinched. They'd heard this symphony before. But inside the wire, 19 German soldiers fell silent, their laughter dying in their throats like a snuffed candle. Richter felt his jaw tighten. He knew that sound. He'd heard it over Normandy when his squadron scattered like leaves before a storm. He'd heard it near Bastogne when thunderbolts turned a panzer column into a ribbon of fire. He'd heard it the day he bailed out over Belgium, his FW-190 shredded by a burst so concentrated it had sawed through his wing spar in under 2 seconds. What these men didn't know, what Richter had learned too late, bloodied and humbled, was that their laughter had always been a lie they told themselves. The flying milk bottle they mocked carried 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, enough firepower to disintegrate a Messerschmitt in 1.8 seconds of sustained fire. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, could chase them from 30,000 feet to the treetops and back. Its armored cockpit could absorb punishment that would atomize a 109. And its pilots, those farm boys and college students they'd dismissed as amateurs, had learned to use altitude, speed, and overwhelming violence to turn air combat into industrial slaughter. The mathematics of their defeat had been written in those broad wings all along: 6 tons of aircraft, 8 machine guns, and the limitless production capacity of a nation that built thunderbolts the way Germany built excuses. Outside, Staff Sergeant Raymond Cole of the 366th Fighter Group leaned against the guard tower, watching the smoke rise from the strafing run 3 miles out. He'd flown P-47s since D-Day, escorting bombers through flak-filled skies and hunting locomotives across France. He understood what those German prisoners inside refused to accept, that the Thunderbolt wasn't a fighter designed to dance. It was a weapon designed to dominate, to outlast, to win through sheer, relentless mechanical inevitability. The prisoners came from the most experienced military in Europe, veterans of blitzkrieg and brutal Eastern Front winters, men who had watched their Luftwaffe rule the skies from Warsaw to Stalingrad. The Americans bombing their cities and strafing their columns had been flying combat missions for barely 18 months. By every measure of experience, tactical doctrine, and warrior tradition, Germany should have owned the sky. But this story isn't about who fought better. It's about who built better. It's about how industrial logic crushed martial pride, how 8 synchronized machine guns became the sound of inevitability, and how German laughter, first heard in cockpits over France, now echoing in prison camps, died in the roar of a machine they never took seriously until it was far too late. The P-47 Thunderbolt hadn't been born from genius. It had been born from desperation. April 1943. Luftwaffe. Fighter base, Beauvais-Tilley, France. Oberleutnant Rolf Hartmann stood on the tarmac with a pair of Zeiss binoculars pressed to his eyes, tracking the ungainly silhouette struggling for altitude over the Channel coast. Behind him, a dozen Luftwaffe pilots from Jagdgeschwader 26 gathered around their sleek Focke-Wulf 190s, watching the American formation lumber eastward like freight trains climbing a mountain grade. "Mein Gott," Hartmann muttered, lowering the binoculars with a smirk. "They've sent us Mobilwagen, furniture trucks with wings." The laughter rippled through the assembled pilots. Lieutenant Franz Keller, a veteran with 19 kills painted beneath his canopy, shook his head in theatrical disbelief. "Look at them! 7 tons if they're a gram." The fuselage alone could house a family of 4. He traced the shape in the air with his hands, the bulbous body, the disproportionate nose, the greenhouse canopy that seemed to trap the pilot inside a glass coffin. This is what happens when engineers forget that fighters must fight, not haul cargo. To men raised on the religion of German precision, the elegant lines of the Bf 109, the predatory efficiency of the FW 190, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt represented everything contemptible about American design philosophy. It violated every principle. It was heavy where fighters should be light, brutish where they should be refined, industrial where they should be artistic. It looked like something hammered together in a factory by men who'd never seen a dogfight. "They'll never turn with us," Hartmann said, lighting a cigarette. "Never climb with us. We'll attack from below, force them into turning fights, and pick them apart like practice targets." He exhaled smoke into the spring air, supremely confident. "This war will be won by skill and engineering, not by throwing metal into the sky and hoping it flies." That same week, Republic Aviation Factory, Farmingdale, New York. 3,000 miles away, Alexander Kartveli stood in a cavernous testing hangar, watching ammunition belts feed into 8 Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the wings of a grounded P-47. The Georgian-born chief designer wore a leather jacket stained with grease and held a stopwatch in his thick hands. "Fire!" he ordered. The sound was apocalyptic. 8 guns synchronized into a single continuous roar. Brrrrt! Spitting 6,400 rounds per minute into a reinforced steel target 400 yards downrange. The concrete floor vibrated. Techs clapped hands over their ears. When the firing stopped after 3 seconds, the target looked like it had been run through a meat grinder. Kartveli walked to the target, running his fingers along the ragged perforations. 21 holes, each the diameter of a man's thumb, clustered within a 2-foot circle. He turned to the assembled engineers, his expression grim. "Gentlemen, the Germans will call this airplane a cow, a truck, a joke," he said in his thick accent. "They will laugh at its weight, mock its appearance, and trust their skill to defeat it. He tapped the shredded steel with his knuckles. But when these guns speak, skill becomes irrelevant. We are not building an airplane. We are building inevitability. Major Donald Blakesley, the RAF Eagle Squadron veteran recently transferred to command American Thunderbolt units, stood at the back of the hangar. He'd flown Spitfires over Britain, nimble, beautiful machines that rewarded finesse and artistry. The P-47 rewarded none of that. It was a blunt instrument, a flying siege engine designed to absorb punishment and deliver annihilation. He understood what Kartvelli meant. The Germans would laugh until the first burst hit home. Then they'd stop laughing forever. The mathematics were already settled. Germany built artists. America built assembly lines. Only one of those won wars. June 26, 1943, 27,000 feet above Évreux, France. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson never saw the Focke-Wulf 190 that nearly killed him. The first 20mm cannon shell punched through his right wing, detonating inside the fuel tank. The second shredded his canopy, filling the cockpit with hurricane winds and glass fragments. The third, fired by Oberfeldwebel Egon Mayer himself, one of the Luftwaffe's most feared aces, slammed into Johnson's headrest, missing his skull by 3 inches. Johnson's P-47, tail number 226395, began hemorrhaging fuel and hydraulic fluid. His windscreen was a spiderweb of cracks. His radio was dead. His instruments showed red across the board. Mayer circled behind him for the kill shot, confident this fat American bomber would spiral into the French countryside like all the others. But Johnson didn't spiral. He pushed the stick forward, diving toward the deck with the Focke-Wulf glued to his tail. At 500 miles per hour, the Thunderbolt came alive, its massive weight becoming an advantage, gravity itself weaponized. Mayer's 190 struggled to keep pace as Johnson plummeted through 20,000 feet, then 15,000, then 10,000, cannon shells chasing him the entire way. 21 hits. Johnson counted them later, standing beside the wreckage on English soil, his hands still shaking. 21 cannon holes, over 200 machine gun strikes, sections of wing torn away, rudder shredded, fuselage perforated like cheese. The armored seat behind his head looked like someone had attacked it with a sledgehammer. The Pratt & Whitney engine, that massive radial beast, had absorbed 12 direct hits and never stopped running. "How?" was all Johnson could say. Staring at the impossible ruin that had refused to die. How? Autumn 1944. POW Compound C. Reims, France. The BBC broadcast crackled through the camp's single radio, monitored by American guards but audible to prisoners pressed against the wire fence. The British announcer's crisp accent cut through the static. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, America's leading ace with 27 confirmed victories, recently described his remarkable survival in a P-47 Thunderbolt that absorbed over 200 hits from German fighters. Klaus Richter felt his stomach drop. He knew that name. Every Luftwaffe pilot knew that name. The American who wouldn't die. The farm boy from Oklahoma who'd somehow survived Egon Mayer. Egon Mayer, with 67 kills, and lived to turn the hunter into the hunted. Beside him, Feldwebel Muller's face had gone pale. 27, he whispered. That's more than most of us, Richter finished. The broadcast continued, detailing Johnson's exploits. The locomotive he'd strafed near Münster, the Bf-109s he'd shredded over Berlin, the bomber formations he'd shepherded through walls of flak. The voice described the P-47's incredible resilience, its ability to absorb punishment that would disintegrate any German fighter, its engine that ran on bullet holes and determination. Werner, the tank commander, stared at the radio with something approaching horror. How does a plane that fat, that ugly, that wrong, how does it refuse to die? No one answered. because the question contained its own terrible revelation. They'd designed fighters like swords, elegant, precise, lethal in skilled hands, but fragile under pressure. The Americans had designed a fighter like a hammer, crude, heavy, inelegant, but impossible to break. You could chip it, dent it, perforate it with cannon fire, and it would keep coming, keep fighting, keep winning through sheer mechanical inevitability. Richter remembered his own last flight, his FW-190, disintegrating after a 2-second burst from a Thunderbolt's guns. Beautiful engineering, shattered by brutal physics. German artistry, crushed by American mathematics. The broadcast ended. The prisoners stood in silence, the weight of that name, Robert Johnson, hanging in the air like an indictment. The ugly plane had refused to die. And now, so had the ugly truth. They'd lost this war the moment they started laughing. August 1943, 56th. Fighter Group Briefing Room, Halesworth, England. Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke stood before a chalkboard covered in altitude diagrams and attack vectors, his pointer tapping against the critical numbers. 30,000 feet, 400 mph, 6 seconds of fire. "Gentlemen, forget everything the RAF taught you about turning fights," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who'd buried too many pilots learning the hard way. "The Thunderbolt doesn't dance. It dictates." He drew a steep diagonal line plunging from the top of the board. "Boom and zoom. We own the altitude. We own the speed. We dive from the sun at 30,000 feet, hit them with everything we have, and climb back to the stratosphere before they can react. No circling, no dogfighting, no chivalry." Major David Schilling, already an ace with 8 kills, understood immediately. "We turn ourselves into 8-gun missiles." Exactly. Zemke circled the convergence point on his diagram. At 400 yards, all 8 Brownings meet in a kill zone 18 inches wide. Anything caught there, Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, doesn't matter, ceases to exist. You don't need to be a better pilot. You need to be higher, faster, and more patient. It was industrial warfare applied to the sky, not art, not honor, just physics, altitude, and overwhelming firepower. September 27, 1943, 28,000 feet above Emden, Germany. The German formation never saw them coming. 12 Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 3, escorting bombers back from a raid, flew in tight defensive weave patterns at 24,000 feet. Above them, invisible against the sun, 16 P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group waited like falcons. Zemke's voice crackled over the radio. "Wolfpack, execute!" They fell out of the sky at terminal velocity, wings screaming, their Pratt & Whitney engines howling as they accelerated past 450 mph. The Germans had perhaps 3 seconds warning, a flicker of shadow, a metallic glint, before the hammer fell. The first Messerschmitt exploded mid-fuselage, its pilot vaporized before he could even register the attack. The second burst into flames, its wings shearing off like paper. The third managed to roll left before 50-caliber rounds sawed through its cockpit, turning the interior into a slaughterhouse. In 11 seconds, 6 German fighters were falling. The survivors scattered in panic, breaking formation, diving for safety. Exactly the wrong response against aircraft that owned speed and altitude. The Thunderbolts climbed effortlessly back to 30,000 feet, repositioned, and dove again. Lieutenant Hans Weick, 19 years old with 3 months of combat experience, watched his entire squadron disintegrate. He'd been taught to turn fight, to trust his aircraft's agility, to engage the enemy with courage and skill. None of it mattered. The Americans didn't fight. They executed. Clinical, mechanical, unstoppable. He survived only because his engine seized from panic-induced overthrottling. His 109 fell like a stone, and the Thunderbolts ignored him, already hunting fresh targets. Autumn 1944. POW Compound C. Reims, France. The evening meal sat untouched as the prisoners listened to de Muller recite names like a funeral prayer. Hartmann, killed over Schweinfurt. Keller, missing over Berlin. Weiss, bailed out near Aachen, never found. Schmidt, Mayer, Becker, Fischer. Richter closed his eyes, seeing their faces. Young men, skilled pilots, veterans who'd survived Poland and Russia, only to be erased by Americans who'd been flying combat for 18 months. Not outflown, not outfought, just processed, fed into an industrial machine that climbed higher, hit harder, and never stopped coming. Werner spoke quietly, his voice hollow. They turned the sky into a factory floor, and we were the product being stamped out. Outside, another formation of P-47s thundered overhead, their engines singing that familiar dirge. No one laughed anymore. July 17, 1944. Route Nationale 158 south of Caen, Normandy. Hauptmann. Ernst Becker watched the sky like a condemned man watching the gallows. His Panther tank idled in a column of 67 armored vehicles. Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, and supply trucks, stretching 3 kilometers along the Norman hedgerow country. They'd been promised Luftwaffe air cover. They'd been promised the roads were clear. They'd been promised reinforcements for the collapsing front at Caen. The promises died when someone shouted, "Jabos!" Fighter bombers. Becker looked up. 8 P-47 Thunderbolts materialized from the clouds, dropping from 8,000 feet in a near-vertical dive that defied physics. Their wings rippled with rockets. Their noses bristled with machine guns. They didn't look like aircraft anymore. They looked like the fist of God descending. The first rocket salvo turned the lead Tiger into a funeral pyre. The second obliterated a half-track, sending bodies tumbling through the air like rag dolls. Then came the guns. Brrrr! The sound was indescribable. Not individual shots, but a continuous roar, like tearing canvas amplified 1,000-fold. 8 machine guns per aircraft, 6,400 rounds per minute per plane, 51,200 rounds per minute total. The mathematics of annihilation rendered in hot lead and tracer fire. Becker watched a Panther's turret, 40 millimeters of hardened steel, punctured like tin foil. He watched 50 caliber rounds walk up the road, each impact raising a geyser of dirt and asphalt, until they found a fuel truck that exploded with such force it flipped an adjacent half-track onto its side. The Thunderbolts made 4 passes. 4 minutes of sustained violence. When they finally climbed away, trailing smoke from their overheated guns, they left behind 43 burning vehicles and a road that looked like the surface of hell. Becker crawled from his disabled Panther, ears ringing, uniform soaked with sweat and blood that wasn't his. Around him, stunned survivors staggered through the wreckage, many weeping openly. Someone whispered the word that would haunt them. Donnerschlag. Thunderclap. August 1944. POW Compound C. Reims, France. The prisoners lined the fence as the horizon erupted in fire. Distant thunder, not weather, but bombs and rockets, rolled across the French countryside. Black smoke columns rose like funeral pyres, each one marking another supply depot, another rail yard, another convoy caught in the open. The ground vibrated with secondary explosions as ammunition dumps cooked off. Klaus Richter gripped the wire, watching a P-47 formation wheel lazily above the carnage, their work complete. He'd flown over 50 combat missions. He'd strafed convoys himself over Poland and Russia. But he'd never seen this: systematic industrial-scale destruction delivered from the sky with casual efficiency. Donnerschlag, Muller muttered beside him, the word spoken like a curse. It had spread through the camp like disease, whispered by tank crews and infantry who'd survived the killing fields of Normandy. The thunderclap, the sound that preceded annihilation. Werner pressed his face against the wire. "My battalion was caught outside Mortain," he said, his voice distant. 18 Tigers. We were invincible, they told us. German engineering. Superior tactics." He laughed, a broken, bitter sound. The Thunderbolts came at noon. By 12:15, 11 tanks were burning. The crews that bailed out were strafed in the fields. I survived because I hid under a corpse. The name had become mythological among German soldiers, not just an aircraft designation, but a prophecy. When you heard Donnerschlag, you had perhaps 30 seconds before the sky opened up and erased you. Tank commanders who'd faced Soviet hordes without flinching would abandon their vehicles at the distant rumble of radial engines. Another explosion bloomed on the horizon. The guards barely looked up, just another Tuesday in liberated France. But the prisoners stared, transfixed, watching their nation's war machine fed into American furnaces, one convoy at a time. "They're not fighting us," Richter said quietly. "They're erasing us." The word spread that night through the barracks, whispered like a prayer to forgotten gods. Donnerschlag, Donnerschlag, Donnerschlag. The thunder that never stopped. The fire that consumed everything. The sound of industrial inevitability. October 1944. POW compound. Dawn. The barracks trembled. Klaus Richter woke to the sound that had haunted his dreams for months. The deep, synchronized thunder of Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines at full power. Not a handful of aircraft. Not a squadron. A fleet. He stumbled outside with 19 other prisoners, faces pressed against the wire as the sky filled with metal. Wave after wave of P-47 Thunderbolts passed overhead in perfect formation. 60, 80, perhaps 100 aircraft, flying east toward Germany with the casual confidence of an army that had already won. "Mein Gott," Muller whispered. "How many do they have?" The answer hung unspoken in the cold morning air. "More than we can count. More than we can fight. More than we can survive." Werner broke the silence first, his voice hollow. "We built art. They built war." The words settled over the group like ash. No one argued. What could they say? That German engineering was superior? They'd believed that once, watching sleek Messerschmitts roll off assembly lines in Regensburg and Augsburg. Precision machines crafted by skilled workers, each fighter a masterpiece of aeronautical design. But the Americans built 18 P-47s per day. Republic Aviation's Farmingdale factory operated 24 hours across 3 shifts, churning out Thunderbolts with the same efficiency Ford used for automobiles. By October 1944, over 12,000 P-47s patrolled European skies. Germany's entire monthly fighter production, all types combined, barely exceeded 1,000 aircraft. "Precision versus production," Richter said bitterly. "We chose the wrong god to worship." Lieutenant Vogel, a former logistics officer, laughed, the sound of a man whose calculations had proved catastrophically wrong. "Do you know what destroyed us? Mathematics." He picked up a stick, scratching numbers in the dirt. June 1944, Germany produces 140,000 tons of aviation fuel per month. America produces 1.4 million tons. We're flying one sortie for every 10 of theirs. The numbers told the story their propaganda had hidden. While German factories carefully assembled fighters by hand, American factories stamped them out like shell casings. While German pilots rationed fuel and flight hours, American pilots trained until muscle memory replaced thought. While German engineers obsessed over incremental improvements, a faster climb rate, a tighter turn radius, American engineers built a fighter that could survive 3 times the punishment and deliver 10 times the firepower. Another formation roared overhead. The prisoners didn't even look up anymore. "I shot down 4 Thunderbolts," said Feldwebel-Haas, a veteran ace with 26 kills. 4. You know how long it took America to replace them? He held up 4 fingers. 22 hours. Less than a day. I risked my life, burned irreplaceable fuel, expended ammunition we couldn't spare. And by the time I landed, 4 new P-47s were already crossing the Atlantic on cargo ships. The industrial gap wasn't just wide, it was civilizational. Germany fielded an army. America fielded an economy. The sound of engines gradually faded eastward, carrying death to cities and rail yards that couldn't hide anymore. In the silence that followed, Werner spoke the truth they'd all been avoiding. "We lost this war in 1941. We just didn't know it until the Thunderbolts arrived to explain it to us." 19 heads nodded in the October cold. The mathematics had always been against them. They'd just been too proud or too blind to see it until the sky itself turned hostile, filled with aircraft too numerous to count, too relentless to escape, too inevitable to defeat. German artistry versus American industry. The contest had never been fair. November 1944, POW compound. Evening. The camp's radio crackled with news that landed like hammer blows. RAF and American bombers struck Dresden with incendiary attacks. Estimates suggest 25,000 casualties. Luftwaffe fighter operations have been reduced to sporadic resistance due to critical fuel shortages. Berlin reports Allied air superiority is now total across all operational theaters. Klaus Richter sat with his back against the barrack wall, listening to his nation burn in real time. Around him, the 19 prisoners who'd once mocked American engineering sat in funeral silence. No one spoke, no one moved. They simply absorbed the catalog of destruction. City after city, factory after factory, the entire industrial infrastructure of the Third Reich being systematically dismantled from 20,000 feet. Muller's hands trembled as he rolled a cigarette from hoarded tobacco. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, Schweinfurt. Each city name was spoken like a prayer for the dead. My sister lived in Hamburg. Lived. Past tense. The word hung heavy. The broadcast continued. 8th Air Force reports minimal Luftwaffe resistance on today's mission to synthetic oil facilities at Leuna. American P-47 Thunderbolts claimed 17 German aircraft destroyed for the loss of 2. 17-2, Vogel whispered. Those aren't combat statistics. That's an execution ratio. Richter closed his eyes, seeing the faces of pilots he'd known. Oberleutnant Hartmann, who'd called the Thunderbolt a furniture truck, killed over France. Hauptmann Keller, who'd mocked its ungainly shape, shot down defending Berlin. Lieutenant Fischerbaum, who'd laughed about pregnant cows in the sky, never returned from Schweinfurt. They'd all laughed, every one of them. The laughter had cost them everything. "We laughed at thunder," Richter said suddenly, his voice barely audible. The others turned to look at him. "We laughed at thunder until it spoke our name." No one responded. The truth needed no elaboration. They'd mocked the aircraft's appearance while ignoring its capability. They'd dismissed American pilots as inexperienced while their own veterans died by the hundreds. They'd trusted in superior German engineering while America buried them in superior American production. They'd believed in skill and artistry while the enemy perfected industrial violence. And now the Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force on Earth, flew less than 100 sorties per day across the entire Western Front. Grounded not by courage, but by mathematics. No fuel, no replacement aircraft, no pilots to replace the dead. The thunder had spoken. Germany had no answer. The next morning, Werner spotted them first, 3 American pilots walking past the compound fence, heading toward the airfield. They couldn't have been older than 22. One was laughing at something his companion said. Another casually adjusted his leather flight jacket against the November cold. The third carried his flight helmet tucked under his arm like a schoolbook. They walked with the ease of men who own the sky. No fear, no hesitation, no doubt that when they climbed into their Thunderbolts, they would return safely from whatever hell they rained down on Germany. The prisoners watched in silence as the Americans passed. One of the pilots glanced at the compound, made brief eye contact with Richter, and nodded. Not cruelly, not triumphantly, just a simple acknowledgement between men who'd fought in the same war from different sides. Then he was gone, heading toward an aircraft that would probably survive its mission, drop its ordnance, claim another kill or two, and return in time for hot food and mail from home. "They're children," Haas said quietly. "Farm boys and college students. We're the veterans. Poland, France, Russia. 4 years of war." "And they beat us," Werner finished. "Those children in flying trucks beat the best pilots Germany ever produced." The words needed no response. The evidence flew overhead daily. Young POW, confident and utterly unstoppable. Richter turned away from the fence, walking back toward the barracks. Behind him, the sound of Pratt & Whitney engines rumbled to life, the same sound that had become the anthem of Germany's defeat. The laughter had died months ago. Only the thunder remained. Present day. National Museum of the United States Air Force, Dayton, Ohio. The P-47 Thunderbolt sits in silent majesty beneath the museum's fluorescent lights, its olive-drab paint faded but still defiant. Tail number 226395, Robert Johnson's aircraft, the plane that refused to die. Visitors circle it slowly, cameras clicking, children pointing at the 8 Browning machine guns protruding from wings that once carved through German formations like scythes through wheat. An elderly man stands apart from the crowd, leaning heavily on a cane, his eyes fixed on the aircraft with an expression that transcends mere observation. His name tag reads Klaus Richter, veteran, Luftwaffe, JG-26. A museum docent approaches gently. "Sir, did you know this aircraft?" Richter doesn't look away from the Thunderbolt. "I knew what it could do," he says, his English tinged with a German accent that 70 years in America never quite erased. "I laughed at it once. From the cockpit of my Focke-Wulf, I called it Dicke Dora, Fat Dora, a flying milk bottle." He pauses, his weathered hand tightening on the cane. "Then I heard the sound." The docent waits. 8 machine guns, Richter continues, his voice distant. 50 caliber Brownings, synchronized. When they opened fire, it wasn't individual shots. It was... He searches for words. It was the sound of inevitability. The sound of mathematics solving a problem. The sound of your death approaching at 2,900 feet per second. He gestures toward the placard listing the aircraft's specifications. 3,400 rounds of ammunition. Combined rate of fire, 6,400 rounds per minute. Maximum speed, 403 km per hour at 30,000 feet. Service ceiling, 42,000 feet. "We built masterpieces," Richter says quietly. "They built this, and this one." Over the museum's speaker system, a recording begins to play. First, the deep rumble of the R-2800 engine at full power, a sound like distant thunder approaching. Then, cutting through the mechanical drone, the unmistakable hammering of 8 synchronized Browning M2 machine guns, opening fire. Brrrr, tat, 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 tat. Parents cover their children's ears. Veterans straighten unconsciously. But Richter stands perfectly still, eyes closed, transported across 8 decades to a French sky where that sound meant death. The recording fades. Silence returns to the museum floor. A young boy tugs his father's sleeve. "Dad, why's that old man crying?" The father glances at Richter, then at the P-47, understanding something his son is too young to grasp. Because he's remembering, buddy. He's remembering. Richter opens his eyes, looking one last time at the aircraft that destroyed his Air Force, his nation's delusions, and his own youthful arrogance. He thinks of Muller, Werner, Vogel, Haas, all the men who sat in that prison camp watching their world burn from behind barbed wire. Most are gone now. He's one of the last. He touches the velvet rope separating visitors from the exhibit, his fingers trembling slightly. "We laughed once," he says to no one in particular, his voice barely a whisper. "In our cockpits over France, in our prison camps, in our pride. We laughed at the fat American plane with its clumsy shape and crude design." He straightens, meeting his own reflection in the Thunderbolt's polished aluminum skin, an old man confronting the ghost of the warrior he'd been. But the sky remembers who owned the Thunder. He turns and walks slowly toward the exit, his cane tapping against the polished floor, leaving the silent aircraft behind. Above him, suspended from the ceiling, a formation of Model P-47s flies eternally eastward, toward a Germany that no longer exists, toward a war that never truly ended for men like him. The museum doors close behind him. The Thunderbolt remains, its guns silent but never forgotten. The roar never fades for those who heard it once.